Hi, everyone. It's 4 o'clock in New York. 9 days in May. They are 9 days at the center of every question about the future of Donald Trump's presidency. 9 days when the fog of the war Donald Trump was waging against his own FBI and Justice Department tested some of the decision-making and the stability of the people in his line of fire. 9 days at the center of questions about whether FBI Director Jim Comey was fired to obstruct the investigation into Donald Trump's ties to Russia. 9 days when questions about whether Donald Trump was actually a Russian agent became tangible enough for a counterintelligence investigation to be opened into the sitting president. 9 days known to be of interest to one Robert S. Mueller. 9 days that forever changed the life and career of our guest this hour, former deputy director and former acting director of the FBI, Andrew McCabe. Let's go through them. On day one, Tuesday, May 9th, 2017, James Comey is fired. 2 days later, Trump sits down with Lester Holt and says Russia was on his mind when he fired Comey. That very same day, we learned in the New York Times that Trump had asked Comey for a loyalty pledge in a private dinner. Comey wouldn't give the president what he wanted. Day 4, Trump tweets at Comey, quote, James Comey better hope there aren't tapes of our conversations before he starts leaking to the press. Day 7, we learned from the Washington Post that Trump revealed highly classified information to Russian officials in the Oval Office. We would later learn that in that same meeting, Trump admitted to the Russians that firing Comey relieved the pressure of the Russia investigation. Day 8, a New York Times report reveals Trump pushed Comey to end the investigation into Mike Flynn shortly after Flynn was fired. All that in the 9 days between James Comey's firing and Robert Mueller's appointment as special counsel on day 9. We're joined by Andrew McCabe now. Thank you for being here. I know you've done a lot, but we're excited to have you. And I want to read, your book is called The Threat, How the FBI Protects America in the Age of Terror and Trump. I want to read how you describe day one that we just read off. This was right after you learned that Jim Comey had been fired. Quote, time stopped for a moment. I should not have been shocked, but I was. One moment you're in an environment that you understand and know how to navigate. Then the lights turn off and turn back on. In half a second and you're standing in a completely different place. What do you do now? What did you do?
Well, I immediately started thinking about how do I get this brilliant, majestic organization of almost 37,000 people to stay the course. That was my primary concern in that moment. You know, through a career of investigations, a career of sitting through hundreds, who knows how many interviews and across the table from people who are witnesses or participants in crimes and horrible acts and disasters, you learn through that experience how to hold your emotions back, to compartmentalize your reactions to those sorts of things. And so I relied on those skills in that meeting with the Attorney General. So when he looked at me and said, I don't know if you've heard, but we've had to fire the director of the FBI, I tried not to react. I tried not to pass judgment. I tried to just say, I hadn't heard that, sir, but of course now I know. And
then you went back to your office, and what did you do?
I went back to the office where the leadership team that I'd been meeting with before I'd been called across the street to meet with the Attorney General was still assembled. You know, oddly, they told me as I left the meeting with the Attorney General not to say anything about this to anyone, which it seemed like a pretty important and major event that I'd have a hard time concealing. And of course, by the time I got across the street, it was already on the news, it was on TV, and my entire team knew about it. So we brought the leaders together in the Deputy Director's conference room, and we started to flesh out a plan. I mean, that's what we do in times of crisis. And I've had the opportunity to learn these processes and these skills managing numerous crises in the Bureau, being involved in, you know, cases from the Boston Marathon bombing to many other terrorist events and responses to horrible mass shootings and things of that nature. And it's those skills that you rely on.
I described you, and I hope you think it's fair, as a process guy, that you were expert in sort of running things the way they were supposed to be run. So you opened 2 investigations that day, is that right? You opened a counterintelligence investigation that day, or
not exactly that day?
What happened?
So that crazy afternoon and evening, I met with the Attorney General, and later, of course, went down the street to meet with the President at his request. The next day, I brought the investigative team together. So I knew from those interactions with the President and the Attorney General that I was likely to be removed from the role of acting director, maybe very quickly.
Why?
because they both said I would probably be removed. They said that they were thinking about bringing in an interim director to run the organization until a permanent director could be confirmed. So realizing that I had very limited time to work with, my first concern was making sure that the Russia investigation was on absolutely solid ground. If someone else was going to come in behind me, someone who might want to end that investigation or somehow diminish or hide the results of that investigation, they wouldn't be able to do it without creating a record of the decisions behind that act. So I sat down with my investigative team and I said, go back and look at every aspect of the work that we're currently doing and come to me with a proposal for any additional work that you think we need to do. Are there cases that we are currently investigating that we should close? Are there other cases that we haven't initiated that you think we should start?
And it was from that meeting with your investigative team that a counterintelligence investigation into the president was opened? That's
right. The recommendation came back to me. Our folks felt like we had an articulable basis to believe that the president might have engaged in obstruction of justice in the firing of Jim Comey, and that if so, there might be a national security risk associated with that obstruction. So that is, of course, the standard for opening an FBI full investigation.
So it was a full investigation, not a preliminary investigation.
That's right, a full investigation.
And that it was a full counterintelligence investigation gave you certain investigative powers, right?
That's correct.
So you could go to the FISA court, right? You could, if the investigative team needed that. They had tools when it became a full counterintelligence investigation?
Sure. So you wouldn't do that right away, right? It's the beginning of an investigation. You would start with those basic investigative steps of trying to understand the person you're investigating, in this case, the President of the United States, the network of people around him, their communications, their relationships, all those sorts of things, the things that investigators do every day when they're building towards, when they're building their way through a case.
I want to ask you, when that investigation that you opened the day after Director Comey was fired intersected, or if it did, a former senior intelligence official reminded me that all of your actions should be sort of evaluated in the context of the broader intelligence work that was underway. That in the summer of 2016, a counterintelligence investigation was opened based on the suspicious conduct of Carter Page and George Papadopoulos, right?
That's correct. So it's a really good point. And I think you have to go back even a little bit further. So at the end of 2015, of course, at the request of President Obama, we, together with our colleagues at the NSA and CIA, put together what we refer to as the ICA, the Intelligence Community Assessment. And that was all of the intelligence that we had at that time that would indicate any level of Russian involvement or meddling in the election. And it was the ICA, in the ICA, we concluded as an intelligence community that absolutely the Russians had interfered in the election, and they had done so for a variety of purposes. So with that knowledge that the Russians have meddled in our election, we then come across the information about people like Carter Page, about people like George Papadopoulos, that leads us to open the very beginnings of what I will refer to as the Russia case, right? That's the investigation into whether or not people in or connected with the Trump campaign may have colluded with the Russians.
And did that have a code name? The Clinton email investigation was called Mid-Year, and learned in your book. What did the Trump investigation have a code name?
It did, but the FBI has asked me not to share that, so I won't.
Is the existence of the counterintelligence investigation also classified?
The existence of the investigation under most circumstances is sensitive, and the way the FBI kind of adjudicates these things is once these issues have been publicly acknowledged, they are
Trump
no longer
tweets about them.
In this case, that's exactly what happened. So I'm very careful in the book not to step over that line. And that's after an arduous, several-month period of going through pre-publication review at the FBI. And then, of course, after that period, the existence of the case was discussed in the media, and then the president very quickly responded to those media articles and in his own communications essentially confirmed the existence of the case. So that's where we are.
And by tweeting at all the people involved, and I guess ultimately decimating the senior leadership of the FBI that opened these cases, the first cases in the summer of 16, and really all the intelligence officials from 2015 are gone as well. Did you ever talk amongst yourselves that you felt, I mean, if this were in a Tom Clancy novel, it would be it would be such an obvious plot line that it would probably get thrown away and the writers told to try again. That
You're
everybody
saying I've lived a poor plot line?
I'm just saying that everyone in the intelligence community that was investigating Russian meddling in 2016, from Director Brennan to former Director Hayden to everyone that either had their clearances stripped or has been targeted with mean tweets from the president, for lack of a more elegant description of them, to everyone at the FBI that either opened the cases in the summer of 2016 or was around you when the counterintelligence case into the president was opened after Jim Comey was fired, have all been fired and or smeared by the president on his Twitter feed. What does that look like to all of you when you sit around, when you're in communication with each other?
It looks terrible. I mean, I hope it looks the same way to us. I hope it looks the same way to the rest of the country as it does to us. There's no question. Look, I mean, people leave government all the time, especially at senior leadership levels. We're further in our service. It's kind of expected. But I've never seen a situation where government professionals, career professionals in government, and particularly in law enforcement and the intelligence agencies, have been so systematically attacked and undermined by the President of the United States himself. It's remarkable.
What happened to the case that you opened the day after Jim Comey was fired? Did you get briefed on it every morning after you opened it?
No. So those cases, the already existing Russia investigations and the case we opened, were all immediately turned over to Director Mueller and became kind of the meat of the special counsel's work at that time.
And did anyone that worked for you when it was under your purview go work for Robert Mueller?
We sent quite a few people over to support Director Mueller's team. I should also mention, Nicole, that we structured our relationship with those folks who are working on that team in a very careful way. So those folks are still FBI employees,
right,
and they're still responsible to our organization. We're responsible for their salaries and all that sort of stuff. But we very much did not want those team members in a position where they'd be constantly having to come back to FBI headquarters or back to their field offices for approvals and for things like that. We wanted them to take direction only from Director Mueller and his staff. So we made that very clear with the special counsel at that time.
Someone described it almost as a big mega U.S. Attorney's office within Maine DOJ, and it's actually not in the same building. Is that right?
That's correct.
Can you explain for me, someone said this to me when it was first reported in the New York Times, that this question arose for you that was serious enough for the counterintelligence investigation to be opened. This question that what we covered in the media as obstruction, the firing of the FBI director.
Right. And
we learned in that 9-day period that he'd been asked to pledge his loyalty to Donald Trump. He'd been asked to drop the Flynn investigation. We'd always covered that as conduct on the president's part that could constitute obstruction of justice. It was described as the obstruction became the collusion. Can you is that because it would be in Vladimir Putin's interest for that investigation to end?
Sure. So it's I think important to understand that it wasn't one event. It wasn't just the firing of Jim Comey. It was a series of curious and odd things that we had been watching and kind of considering as we progressed through the pre-existing Russia case, right? Those 4 or so cases that we had been investigating since the end of the summer of 2016.
Can you describe, were they public statements? Were
Sure.
they private statements? Were they intercepts? What were they?
Generally, the president was very clear about the fact that he wasn't happy about what we were doing. He consistently referred to the Russia investigation as a hoax. He demeaned the investigative efforts and the purpose of the investigation in the media. So those are, while these are, this is talk from the president that people are very familiar with and kind of immune to these days, to investigators conducting an investigation, we start to ask ourselves, why? Why is the president so clearly indicating his displeasure with what we're doing? The next really tough thing for us to figure out was the president's request to Jim Comey to drop the Flynn investigation, which was part of our ongoing Russia effort. So, for me, that was really a watershed moment. I remember driving home. I think it was Valentine's Day. Jim called me. I took the call in the car, and he related very generally to me the content of the conversation that he had that day with the president. And I remember thinking, like, This is not something that we can explain away as an ignorance or a lack of sophistication about how the Justice Department works and the sensitivity of FBI work and what that relationship should be like between a president and an FBI director. This was an overt effort to put a finger on the scales of justice, to eliminate some of the work that we were doing for their own purposes of self-preservation or whatever they were pursuing. So that was a watershed moment. And then, of course, when we didn't stop the Flynn investigation, the president fired Director Comey. So once that happened, and then the president followed that firing with his own inexplicable comments about thinking about Russia when he fired the director, we then had in our hands undeniable facts that clearly formed an articulable basis to believe that a federal crime may have been committed and that a threat to national security might exist. And that is the standard that the FBI must reach before you open a full investigation.
I watch enough Fox to have this question on my brain, and it's probably not a healthy exercise for me mentally. But I worked in the White House, and we would sometimes red team ourselves. Could you red team the opposite? What would the case be for not asking these questions? Why does Donald Trump meet alone in the Oval Office with Kislyak and Lavrov and not have American press in there? Why does Donald Trump defend the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, something that modern Russians don't even really do anymore? Why does Donald Trump meet with Putin 5 times and have no notes, no documents, no evidence? Why, on the sidelines of NATO, does he meet with Putin with only Putin's investigator? What is the argument? What possible defense would there be for not taking the steps you did?
We have exactly those sorts of conversations, right? We don't take these steps lightly. These were matters that we discussed broadly across the folks that were working in this investigative team. We had my closest advisors, the general counsel from the FBI, all participated in these discussions, and we kept coming back again and again to those why questions that we just could not answer. Ultimately, I had these same conversations with Rod Rosenstein, and he saw them the same way that I did. There is no rational, tactical, diplomatic explanation to the things that we were seeing. And I think many of the things that you've just related are additional concerning circumstances, inexplicable actions on the part of the president, specifically with respect to Russia.
I want to ask you about Rosenstein, not the 25th Amendment and the wire, because that's been trodden and
Sure.
every time. But I pulled out his memo. This was the memo that he wrote. And I remember Kellyanne Conway standing on the north lawn of the White House the day that Jim Comey was fired and flipping through this and reading it. And I remember thinking, ooh, I don't think this is going to end well for anybody. But Rosenstein wrote in his memo, the FBI has long been regarded as our nation's premier federal investigative agency. Over the past year, however, the FBI's reputation and credibility have suffered substantial damage and has affected the entire Department of Justice. That is deeply troubling to many department employees and veterans, legislators, and citizens. Is that true? The entire Department of Justice had its reputation and credibility suffered substantial damage?
That's really hard for me. I had some of the same questions, right, when I read the memo the night that Jim was fired. I certainly don't know that to be true. I don't know what Rod is referring to there. I don't have any evidence of that.
You describe him.
And that's to be fair, Nicole. I know that there were a lot of people in the Department of Justice and around the country who had a lot of questions with the way that we'd handled
giant bureaucracy.
The Clinton email case, right? There were many controversial things about that case. I know that people saw it differently, and many people disagreed with some of the decisions we made.
You were asked about some of the substance of this memo when you testified before Congress. You were asked about morale at the FBI, not about the broader Department of Justice, and your testimony is not consistent with this description.
No, it's not.
I want to read how you describe Rod Rosenstein. So what you write about him is that you went back to see him after the meeting. You describe it.
Right.
Rosenstein wondered aloud if there was some way to collect explicit evidence of the president's apparent motivations and put it unequivocally on the record. No option for doing so seemed feasible. In any case, the president already had publicly made the connection between Comey's firing and this Russia thing with his comments to Lester Holt. Did Rod get used by the president to fire Comey?
I don't know, and I can't sit here with you today and say kind of what was in Rod's mind, what was Rod thinking. I can tell you what I observed. I never saw Rod indicate any regret with writing the memo or with the reasons that he stated in the memo. I think Rod was surprised by the White House's kind of rollout of the firing and Rod's memo, and their effort to kind of put Rod, to make it appear as if Rod had, initiated the effort on his own and was really the driving force behind it. That, I understood, was not the case, and certainly not from the events that Rod related to me.
I want to ask you about some of what we've learned about the people that were ensnared in the Russia investigation before you left. Mike Flynn was interviewed. You sent, or you were involved in dispatching agents over to interview him. You called him, right, and asked if that would be okay?
I did.
And what happened when agents went over? He lied?
Yeah, so he sent agents over. They sat down with him. He was gracious. He answered their questions. He did so in a way that appeared to be kind of credible and related. He was able to relate a chronological version of the events. These are all things that we look for as investigators, right? But the problem was the answers that he gave were in direct contradiction to the information that we had about those matters.
And the information you had was him in his own voice on an intercepted conversation with a Russian, right?
I don't want to confirm the exact sort of information we had, but I'll just say that we were very confident that we understood the details of his interactions with Ambassador Kislyak.
And he has now pleaded guilty to lying to your agents about conversations with Russians.
That's right.
Jeff Sessions ultimately recused from overseeing the Russia investigation for lying about conversations with Russians. Everyone else we've talked about being under investigation when they came in contact with U.S. law enforcement officials and associates lied about their conversations with Russians. So it's weird enough. I worked on three presidential. It's weird enough to have conversations with Russians
at all
when you work for someone running for president. Right. But then this campaign that's been described as the band that can't shoot straight, they all told you or your representatives the same lie about the same thing. As someone who prosecuted Russian organized crime, what does that conduct look like?
It looks terrible. I mean, it looks terrible. It's the kind of thing that I think all Americans, from wherever you stand or sit on the political spectrum, whether you supported this president or you don't, you voted for him, you didn't, put all that aside and just ask yourself, have we ever had an administration that had this volume of connections with our most considerable, most formidable adversary and gone to such extents to cover those connections up? These are things that prompt questions in investigators' minds. We get back to that why. Why is this? Why would the president try to potentially obstruct justice and negatively impact our investigation into Russia? Why are his associates and the people around him and the people in his key positions lying about their contacts with Russians? These are very concerning questions and things that need to be investigated.
And my last question on this topic, did you ever investigate a mob organization where Uncle Sal and everybody told the same lie, but the person at the top didn't know about it?
No. This is classic kind of criminal enterprise behavior, right? You have a strong leader who rules by force of will and personality, who demands unquestioned loyalty from those people around him. That is an act of self-preservation. That leader knows that he's got to have that loyalty. He's got to be sure that people are on his side. If you're not on his side, you're against him. And if you don't have that, it's a threat to his very existence, his or her very existence. Those are some of the same traits that I saw interacting with the president and the folks in his administration. Some of them.
Donald Trump attacked you today, so we're going to sneak in a break and ask you about it on the other side.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.